Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was a bright, sunny morning when the group of students from Westlake High boarded the bus for their field trip. They were heading to a remote historical site nestled deep in the countryside, an old, abandoned asylum that had been closed for decades. Rumors had circulated for years about the place being haunted, but the teachers dismissed it as superstition. The students, eager for adventure, were excited. Little did they know, this trip would turn into a nightmare none of them would ever forget. The drive was long, with the landscape shifting from suburban streets to dense forests and winding, desolate roads. The air grew heavier, and the deeper they traveled into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Trees loomed like dark sentinels on either side of the bus, blocking out the sun in certain spots, casting an eerie shadow over the vehicle. The students joked nervously, trying to shake the growing unease, but the jokes quickly died when the bus suddenly slowed to a crawl. The driver, a grizzled man with a weathered face, glanced nervously at the road ahead. "Something's wrong," he muttered under his breath. Then, as if in response to his words, the bus came to a complete stop. The students looked around, confused, as the driver tried the ignition again, but the engine refused to start. The teacher, Mrs. Hall, stood up and asked everyone to remain calm. "It's probably just the old bus," she said, her voice a little shakier than usual. "We'll be fine." But the silence in the air felt unnatural, as if something was watching them. The students sat there, hearts pounding, waiting for the bus to start up again. Moments later, the driver gave up trying to restart the bus and stood up. "I'll take a look at the engine," he said, stepping out into the thick woods surrounding them. The teacher gathered the students, instructing them to stay inside the bus until the driver returned. Time passed slowly, and the sound of the wind in the trees was the only thing that broke the heavy silence. The students exchanged uneasy glances, wondering what was taking the driver so long. One student, Jamie, couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She whispered to her friends, "I swear I saw someone moving in the woods." Her friends laughed it off, attributing it to nerves, but Jamie couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was out there watching them. Minutes turned into hours. The students were becoming restless, their initial excitement replaced with a creeping dread. Mrs. Hall finally decided to investigate. She stepped off the bus, calling out for the driver, but received no answer. The others watched, frozen with fear, as she disappeared into the woods. The students on the bus could hear the distant sound of her voice, but it quickly faded into silence. Then, without warning, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. The students' hearts stopped and panic set in. Someone grabbed the emergency door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. They tried the windows, locked. They were trapped. The scream echoed again, but this time it was followed by footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the woods. The students huddled together, holding their breath, hoping it was just some wild animal. But the footsteps grew louder, too heavy, too deliberate. Something human, or something pretending to be human, was coming closer. A shadow appeared at the edge of the bus. The students' eyes went wide as they saw the figure standing just outside the window, staring at them through the glass. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, its face a grotesque mask of pale skin and hollow eyes. It smiled, but it wasn't a smile that any human could make. It was a twisted, unnerving grin, filled with malice. In a flash of terror, one of the students, Derek, grabbed a backpack and threw it at the window, hoping to break it open. The moment it hit the glass, the figure vanished. The bus was suddenly quiet again, but that silence was far worse than the scream. For what felt like an eternity, no one dared move. Then the door finally opened. The driver, pale and covered in sweat, had stepped inside, shaking. "We need to leave. Now," he said, his voice trembling. He didn't elaborate, but the fear in his eyes was enough to convince the students that something terrible had happened to Mrs. Hall. As they sped back down the winding road, the woods around them seemed to close in, and the students could swear they saw figures moving between the trees, always just out of sight, always lurking. The bus eventually broke free from the forest, and the feeling of being watched slowly faded. When they finally made it back to the school, no one spoke about the field trip again. Mrs. Hall was never seen again, and the driver quit his job soon after. But the students, all of them, carried the terror of that day with them. They knew they hadn't imagined what they saw. That thing in the woods wasn't just a figment of their fear, it was real. The school eventually stopped organizing field trips to that site. No one could explain what happened, but some things are better left unexplained. The students who went on that trip never spoke of it again. But when they walked past the woods on the outskirts of town, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them from the shadows, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to wander too close.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a simple science field trip to a nearby cave system for a group of high school students. The teacher, Mr. Williams, was a seasoned guide who'd taken students on trips like this for years. The cave was small, safe, and well mapped. There was no reason for anyone to feel nervous, but as they made their way down the narrow path toward the entrance, something felt off. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the forest surrounding them seemed unnaturally quiet, as though even the animals knew to stay away. The group entered the cave, their flashlights illuminating the ancient, jagged walls. They had been told stories of the cave's history, how it had been used by early settlers, how it was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of those who had perished inside. But those were just stories, right? At least, that's what they all told themselves. As they ventured deeper, the cave seemed to grow colder. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in around them. When one student, Sarah, turned to ask Mr. Williams a question, she noticed something strange. There was no echo. Not in the way you'd expect in a large cave. It was as if the sound was swallowed the moment it left her mouth. She dismissed it at first, but the longer they walked, the more it bothered her. The group moved through a narrow passage, and then they came to a large chamber where the ceiling arched high above them. It was the perfect spot for a break. As they sat down, a strange sound echoed through the chamber, soft at first, but growing louder. It wasn't the usual drip of water or the distant sound of the wind. This was something else. It sounded almost like breathing, low and slow, like someone, or something, was exhaling right behind them. The students looked around, but no one could see anything. Mr. Williams told them to stay calm, that it was just the wind moving through cracks in the rock. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She felt it, something watching them, something lurking in the dark. Just as they were about to continue their journey deeper into the cave, one of the students, Mark, wandered off. No one saw him leave, but when they turned around, he was gone. Panic spread like wildfire through the group. They called his name, but only silence answered. They rushed back to the entrance, but the path seemed longer than before, the walls pressing in on them as if the cave was closing, trying to trap them inside. Minutes felt like hours. The temperature dropped, and their breath fogged in the freezing air. They couldn't find their way back to the entrance. The cave was like a maze now, every tunnel looking the same, every turn leading them deeper into the darkness. And all the while, that low, rhythmic breathing sound continued, growing louder, closer, like something was following them. They finally found an opening, but it wasn't the cave's exit. It was another chamber, larger, more suffocating. And standing in the center of it, illuminated by the weak light of their flashlights, was Mark. He was standing motionless, staring at them with wide, empty eyes. When they tried to approach him, his head jerked toward them with unnatural speed. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered in a voice that didn't sound like his own. "It's too late." Before anyone could react, Mark turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing into the depths of the cave. The students screamed, but their voices were muffled by the heavy silence that followed. Mr. Williams led them back toward the exit, his face pale, but they couldn't find their way out. The cave had changed, the walls had shifted, the path they had taken before was gone. Hours later, they were still lost. The sound of breathing grew louder, surrounding them from every direction. There was no escape. Finally, they stumbled upon a narrow tunnel that seemed to lead upward. They followed it, hoping for a way out, but when they emerged, they didn't find sunlight. They didn't find the outside world at all. Instead, they found themselves back in the same chamber where Mark had vanished. The low, slow breathing had stopped, but the sound of footsteps in the darkness was unmistakable. The last thing they saw before their flashlights went out was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched wide in a grin. Then everything went black. When the rescue team finally arrived the next morning, they found the cave entrance empty. There was no sign of the students, no sign of Mr. Williams or Mark. Only deep, unsettling footprints that led into the cave's heart and nothing more. No one ever went back inside. The cave remained sealed, its dark secrets hidden from the world. And as for the students who disappeared, some say they were taken by whatever lives in the dark places, the ones who walk in the silence, breathing softly as they wait for the next unsuspecting group to wander too far.
Story number 3.
It started like any other school trip. The students from Mill Creek High School were excited for their overnight stay at the historic lighthouse on the coast. The place was old, isolated, and full of history, perfect for a group of students eager to learn about the past. But as they piled onto the bus, none of them realized that they would be witnessing a part of history that no one was meant to see. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, but it had been reopened recently for educational purposes. The group of 12 students, along with their chaperones, arrived late in the afternoon. The place looked just as they had imagined, a towering, crumbling structure surrounded by jagged rocks and the crashing sound of waves below. It was breathtaking but unsettling. Their guide, an older man named Mr. Thatcher, greeted them with a solemn nod. He had worked there for years and seemed used to the solitude. "Stay close," he warned them as they stepped onto the grounds. "This place has a long history and not all of it is pleasant." The students laughed nervously, assuming it was just a way to set the mood for a spooky tour. The lighthouse was full of old maritime relics, abandoned rooms, and faded photographs of past keepers. There were stories, tales of mysterious disappearances, strange noises in the night, and the occasional sighting of a figure standing at the top of the lighthouse, staring out over the water. But these were just stories, right? As the sun set and the group settled into their rooms, the air grew thick with fog. It was the kind of fog that seemed to swallow sound, the kind that made everything feel claustrophobic, even though they were surrounded by open space. Dinner was served in the common room, and Mr. Thatcher warned them again to avoid the upper levels of the lighthouse. "The stairs are unstable," he said. "Don't go up there." Curiosity gnawed at the students, and after Mr. Thatcher retired for the night, they decided to explore. There was something about the upper levels of the lighthouse that seemed to call to them, something beyond just the curiosity of a restricted area. They crept up the creaky stairs, the fog outside pressing against the windows like an unseen force. At the top, the view was surreal. The ocean roared beneath them and the fog hung like a shroud, casting everything in an eerie light. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier up there, as though it was thick with the weight of years of secrets. And there was a smell, something foul like old oil mixed with decay. The students huddled together, exchanging uneasy glances. That's when they heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping coming from one of the rooms. It was slow at first, almost like a heartbeat. Then it picked up speed. The students froze, hearts racing, and then the door creaked open on its own. Inside was an old desk, papers scattered across it. But what caught their attention was the wall, covered in strange symbols and markings, as though someone had been frantically scribbling on it over the years. But it wasn't the symbols that unsettled them. It was the figure. Standing by the window was a tall, thin man, wearing tattered clothes. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in years. His fingers tapped against the wall in a rhythmic pattern, like he was trying to communicate through the beat. The students wanted to scream, but their voices caught in their throats. One of the braver students, Emily, stepped forward, but as she did, the figure turned toward them, its eyes locking with hers. There was a brief moment of stillness, and then the figure opened its mouth. No sound came out at first, but then, softly, just above a whisper, it spoke. "They never leave." The words were almost drowned out by the sound of the wind howling outside, but the students heard them clearly. The figure's lips stretched into a grotesque grin, and the temperature in the room dropped. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows harder now, and it was as if the walls themselves were closing in. Panicked, the students backed toward the door, but it slammed shut in front of them, trapping them inside. The tapping resumed, faster now, echoing off the walls, filling their ears with a maddening rhythm. Emily reached for the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Then the figure began to move. It stepped toward them, its body swaying unnaturally, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. The students screamed, pounding on the door, but the figure's eyes never left Emily. It was as if it was drawn to her, its presence growing colder and darker. With a final, desperate effort, Emily threw her weight against the door, and it crashed open. The students stumbled out into the hall, breathless and terrified. They didn't stop running until they were back in the common room, where Mr. Thatcher was waiting, his face ashen. "You shouldn't have gone up there," he said quietly, almost sadly. The students tried to explain, but he only shook his head. "The lighthouse has a long history," he murmured, "and some things don't want to be disturbed." They left the next morning, their minds filled with confusion and terror. When they asked Mr. Thatcher about the figure, he was silent, but they noticed something strange. The lighthouse keeper's office was empty. The papers on his desk were scattered, and the same rhythmic tapping sound echoed faintly from the upper levels. No one ever saw Mr. Thatcher again. He was never found, and the students who had witnessed that night's horrors never spoke about it. But some say if you visit the lighthouse today, you can still hear the tapping, slow and rhythmic, coming from the upper floors, as though the figure is waiting for someone new to disturb the silence.
Story number 4.
The annual camping trip was something the students of Ridgewood High School always looked forward to. Every year, they'd venture into the dense forest near a small, abandoned town, a place shrouded in mystery and steeped in local lore. This year was no different. Mr. Daniels, the history teacher, had been organizing the trips for years, and while the students were excited, they always felt a strange tension in the air, especially when they ventured into the woods. No one dared venture past the old iron gates leading into the town, and no one really talked about the town's history, at least, not openly. The journey started as it always did. The group of 15 students, backpacks laden with camping gear, gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. As the night deepened, the conversation turned to the town. Rumor had it that the town had been abandoned in the 1950s after a series of strange disappearances and inexplicable deaths. People who lived there had simply packed up and left in the middle of the night. No one really knew why, but the stories said it was cursed. It was around midnight when things started to get weird. As the students sat around the fire, the wind picked up, causing the trees to creak and groan in a way that didn't seem natural. They dismissed it as just the wind, until the ground beneath them trembled. At first, it was subtle, just a small vibration, like a distant rumble of thunder. But then it became more pronounced, the ground shaking violently enough that their cups and plates rattled. Everyone froze, staring at each other in confusion. Then, as quickly as it started, the trembling stopped. The fire flickered out for a moment, casting the group in darkness. Mr. Daniels, who had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, stood up. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There's something we need to investigate." Despite the unease settling in their stomachs, the students followed him. The group moved deeper into the forest toward the iron gates. They came to a clearing, and in the distance they saw it, the outline of the abandoned town, its structure silhouetted against the dark sky. There was something off about it. The houses seemed decayed, but not in the way time would have caused them to deteriorate. It was as though they had been abandoned in a hurry, hastily left behind as if something was chasing them. No one had ever dared to go inside, not since the last person who lived there had simply vanished. Mr. Daniels motioned for them to stay back as he approached the gate. "Don't go any closer," he said, but the group didn't listen. They were drawn to it, inexplicably curious about what lay beyond. One student, Mark, pushed the gate open, and as the metal creaked, a chill ran down everyone's spine. They stepped into the town, the air growing colder with each step. The streets were eerily silent, no sounds of animals or even the wind. It was as though the town had been frozen in time. The group walked deeper into the town, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows on the crumbling buildings. Then, out of nowhere, they heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound like a child's laughter, echoing from one of the nearby houses. It was faint, but unmistakable. The students stopped dead in their tracks, eyes wide with terror. "I think we should go back," Emily, one of the students, whispered, her voice trembling. But before anyone could move, the laughter grew louder, almost as if it was coming toward them. The lights flickered, the wind howled, and then, one by one, the doors of the houses creaked open. From inside the buildings came more sounds, footsteps, low murmurs, whispers of names of the students who were present. Mark, Emily, Jason. The whispers echoed in their ears, growing louder, more insistent and impossible to ignore. The group tried to turn around and leave, but they were surrounded. Figures began to appear in the windows of the houses, pale faces staring out at them with vacant, hollow eyes. The figures didn't move, but the students could feel their gaze burning into them, making their skin crawl. Then, from the house closest to them, a figure emerged. It was a man, his face obscured by a dark hood. He stepped into the street, and the ground seemed to shake beneath his feet. He reached out with one hand, pointing directly at the students. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice deep and gravelly, like it had been pulled from the depths of the earth itself. "Now you'll stay, just like the others." Before anyone could react, the wind picked up with terrifying force, slamming into them with the power of a freight train. They were thrown to the ground, disoriented and terrified. When they looked up, the figure was gone. The town, which had felt lifeless and abandoned moments before, was now alive with movement. Figures shifted in the shadows, pacing silently, waiting. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the streets, growing louder, more frantic. The students scrambled to their feet, panic setting in. They ran for the gate, but the town seemed to stretch out, the road ahead never ending, the buildings growing taller, more oppressive. No matter how fast they ran, they couldn't escape. The laughter followed them, growing closer with each step. Finally, when they were on the verge of collapse, the gate appeared before them, as though it had moved to meet them. They pushed through it and stumbled back into the forest, gasping for breath. The town was silent again, and the gate swung shut behind them. The next morning, when they returned to camp, the students tried to explain what had happened, but Mr. Daniels remained eerily quiet. The others seemed just as shaken, but when they returned to the town to show the teachers the eerie buildings and figures, it was gone. There was no sign of the town, just an empty field, as if it had never been there. But every year since, the students who ventured into the abandoned town have had the same dreams. Dreams of dark figures standing in the streets, calling their names, pulling them closer to the shadows. And though the town is gone, they can never shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander into its grip.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a simple weekend retreat. A group of college friends decided to rent a remote cabin for a few days to unwind and catch up. Nestled deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization, the cabin was perfect, secluded, quiet, and surrounded by dense forest. The kind of place that seemed to promise peace and solitude. But what they didn't know was that the cabin was far more isolated than they could have ever imagined, and it had a past. The group arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin was older than they expected, with cracked windows, wooden beams that creaked when they walked beneath them, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it had a certain charm to it, the kind of rustic charm that made them feel like they were living in a fairy tale. At least, that's what they thought at first. As the sun set and the fire crackled in the hearth, they settled in for a night of stories and laughter, drinking wine and playing card games. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere shifted. The woods outside grew unnervingly quiet, and the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed to vanish. A deep, unnatural silence settled in, one that none of them could explain. They shrugged it off as just their imaginations running wild. After all, it was late, and the isolation was beginning to take its toll. But then the first strange occurrence happened. As they were playing cards in the living room, one of the friends, Lisa, suddenly stopped and stared at the door. "Did anyone hear that?" she asked, her voice tight with unease. The others paused, trying to listen, but all they could hear was the crackling of the fire. "I swear I heard footsteps outside," Lisa said. "Probably just an animal," Mark, the most skeptical of the group, replied. "Nothing to worry about." They tried to brush it off, but the tension lingered. Then, moments later, another sound, this time a low, deliberate knock on the front door. It was slow, methodical, as if whoever was knocking had all the time in the world. Everyone froze. No one had seen anyone outside. There had been no cars or other signs of life for miles. Reluctantly, Mark stood up and approached the door. He opened it, half expecting to see a prankster or some local playing a joke. But the porch was empty, save for the swirling mist that had begun to settle in from the forest. He closed the door quickly, his unease growing. "Maybe we should go inside, get some rest," Mark suggested, trying to sound calm, but the others could see the fear in his eyes. That night, they slept uneasily, with the strange noises continuing intermittently, scraping sounds from outside, whispering winds, faint tapping on the windows. But it wasn't until the following morning that the real horror began. The group woke up to find the cabin colder than it had been the night before, despite the fire that had burned low. They gathered around the kitchen table for breakfast, but something felt wrong. There was an odd smell in the air, a mix of damp earth and something rotten. As they began to look around, they noticed that something was off in the living room. The furniture was out of place, moved, as if someone had been inside while they slept. But they hadn't heard anyone enter. They tried to rationalize it. Maybe they had moved things around last night and forgotten. But then they saw it, the most chilling detail of all. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like dark red ink, were words. They weren't legible at first, just a jumble of symbols and strange characters. But as they stared, the shapes began to take form. "They're coming for you. You can't leave." The message was barely visible, as if it had been smeared across the wall. But there was no mistaking it. The handwriting wasn't human. It was jagged, uneven, as if whoever had written it had used something unnatural to make the marks. Something that didn't belong in the cabin. Panic set in. The group rushed outside, hoping to find any sign of life, any explanation for what was happening. But the forest around them was thick, silent. The trees loomed over them, casting deep shadows across the ground. And as they walked further into the woods, they began to feel it. The sensation of being watched, the prickling on the back of their necks that made them feel like they weren't alone. That's when they heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too human. They turned, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the woods. Then one of the group, Sarah, suddenly screamed. "Look!" she shouted, pointing toward the clearing. They all turned, and their blood ran cold. At the edge of the clearing, standing in the trees, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and impossibly thin, it was silhouetted against the dimming light of the afternoon. Its face was hollow, a mask of twisted skin stretched over an unnatural skull. The figure didn't move. It simply stared at them with eyes that were hollow and black, like the depths of a void. Before they could react, the figure raised a hand, and the ground beneath their feet trembled again. This time, violently. The earth shook, and the cabin behind them began to groan, as though it was about to collapse in on itself. The group turned and fled, running as fast as they could back toward the cabin, but it felt like the woods were closing in on them. The trees seemed to shift, blocking their path, the figure's presence growing stronger, like a force they couldn't escape. They finally reached the cabin, breathless and terrified, but as they entered, they realized something even more horrifying. The door had locked behind them, and the sound of footsteps wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from inside. They turned slowly, eyes wide with terror, only to see the figure standing in the doorway, a grotesque smile spreading across its twisted face. The whispers filled the air, growing louder, almost deafening. And just before everything went black, they heard one final whisper, "You will never leave." The police found the cabin days later, abandoned, with no sign of the group. There were no bodies, no traces of them ever having been there. But the smell of decay still lingered in the air, and on the walls of the cabin, there was a new message, written in the same dark red ink. "They're here now." Some say the group is still trapped in the woods, wandering in the dark, lost to the ever-watchful eyes of the forest.
Story number 6.
It was supposed to be a fun trip, just a simple overnight visit to an old Civil War battlefield for a group of high school students taking an advanced history class. Their teacher, Mr. Langley, had organized it, calling it an immersive learning experience. The battlefield was located deep in the countryside, miles away from the nearest town. It was well known for its brutal history, a place where thousands of soldiers had died, their bodies left to rot under the open sky before being buried in mass graves. As the bus pulled up to the site just before sunset, the students filed out, stretching their legs and taking in the eerie stillness of the place. The field was vast, dotted with old cannons, rusted rifles on display, and a dilapidated stone monument commemorating the fallen soldiers. There were no other visitors. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a dull gray light. The wind was cold, biting through their jackets, and there was an odd smell in the air, damp earth mixed with something else, something metallic, like rusted iron. The group set up camp near an old barn, one of the last remaining structures from the war. It was weathered and sagging, its wooden walls blackened with age. Mr. Langley gathered them around to share ghost stories about the battlefield, how soldiers' spirits were said to wander the fields at night, how strange voices could be heard in the wind, how some visitors had claimed to see figures standing in the fog. Most of these stories are just legend, he said with a chuckle. But then again, history has a way of leaving its mark. That night, as the students settled into their tents, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, making the old barn creak and groan like it was alive. Around midnight, Sarah, one of the students, woke up to a strange sound, low whispers like voices carried on the wind. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and strained to listen. The whispers weren't coming from inside the tent. They were outside, near the field. Curious but uneasy, Sarah peeked out through the tent flap. The field was empty, except for a strange mist creeping across the grass. The air felt unnaturally cold. Then, just beyond the mist, she saw something move. At first, she thought it was one of the other students, but as the shape stepped into the faint glow of the moonlight, she realized it wasn't anyone she knew. It was a soldier. He stood still, barely visible through the swirling fog. His uniform was tattered and torn, his face obscured by shadow. He didn't move. He only stood there, staring at the tents. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Something about him felt wrong, deeply wrong. Then, without warning, his head jerked in her direction. Sarah gasped and stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She scrambled to wake her friend Emma, shaking her violently. "Someone's out there!" she whispered frantically. Emma groggily sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What are you talking about?" Sarah turned back to look through the tent flap, but the soldier was gone. The field was empty again. Emma dismissed it as a bad dream, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The next morning, the group set out to explore the battlefield. They walked along the old trenches, ran their hands over bullet-ridden trees, and studied the eerie silence that hung over the place. Mr. Langley led them to a small clearing, where he pointed out the site of a mass grave. "This is where they buried over 200 soldiers," he explained. "Confederates, Union soldiers. Some of them weren't even given proper burials, just left here in the earth." As he spoke, Sarah noticed something odd. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, like it was freshly dug earth. But that didn't make sense. This grave was over 100 years old. Then Jason, one of the boys in the group, let out a sharp cry. "What the hell?" Everyone turned to see him stumbling backward, his face pale. He pointed to something in the dirt, a skeletal hand. It was jutting out of the earth, fingers curled, as if clawing its way out of the grave. A scream broke the silence. One of the girls ran, and suddenly, the ground beneath them all trembled. The wind picked up violently, whipping around them, carrying voices, whispers, and groans, angry and pleading. Sarah turned to run, but something caught her ankle, something cold and rough, like fingers made of bone. She screamed and kicked, breaking free, and when she looked back, there was nothing there. The students scattered, running back toward the camp. The whispers grew louder, turning into full voices, overlapping, screaming in agony. The air grew thick, heavy with something invisible pressing down on them. When they reached the campsite, Mr. Langley was nowhere to be found. They called his name, but the wind drowned out their voices. Then Sarah saw them, figures standing at the edge of the field. Soldiers, dozens of them, their faces shadowed, their uniforms ripped and soaked in mud and blood. They stood completely still, like an army waiting for a command. Then, one by one, they raised their hands and pointed at the students. The ground beneath them trembled again. Jason grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to go. Now!" The group ran for the bus, shoving their way inside and slamming the doors shut. The bus driver, a grizzled old man who had been asleep, jolted awake. "What the hell's going on?" "Drive!" someone screamed. "Just drive!" The driver didn't ask questions. He started the engine, and the bus roared to life, peeling out of the campsite. As they sped away, Sarah looked out the window one last time. The soldiers were still standing there. But one of them, the same one she had seen the night before, had moved closer. He stood just at the edge of the road watching them leave, and as the bus pulled away, she swore she saw him smile. Mr. Langley was never found. The authorities searched the battlefield for days but found no trace of him. No footprints, no clues, nothing. The only thing they found was his notebook, abandoned near the mass grave. The last thing he had written before he vanished was scrawled messily across the page, like he had written it in a hurry. "They don't want us here. They never left."
Story number 7.
It was a small, seemingly insignificant town nestled on the edge of a vast forest. To anyone passing through, it was just another sleepy place where nothing ever seemed to happen. But to the few who lived there, it was known as a place with a dark history, a place where people had a habit of disappearing. The legend of Hollow Creek was whispered between townsfolk, but never spoken too loudly. No one was ever able to explain what happened to those who vanished, and the few people who tried to dig into the past were always the ones who never came back. One summer, a group of 5 friends, college students looking for adventure, decided to visit the town. They had heard the rumors, of course, but figured it was just another ghost story meant to scare off the curious. They didn't believe in that sort of thing. The town was remote, and the old houses and forested trails looked like the perfect backdrop for a weekend getaway. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun high in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet town. The town square was eerily empty. No one walking the streets, no vendors at the market. Just the occasional old man sitting on a bench, staring off into the distance, eyes distant and hollow. The group shrugged it off, checked into a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Craven, and began to explore. Everything was fine until that evening. After dinner, they ventured into the woods behind the bed and breakfast, eager to hike the trails and see what the area had to offer. The forest was dense, the trees ancient and towering, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the fading light. The further they walked, the quieter it became. Not a single bird chirped, not a rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as though the entire forest had fallen silent. One of the friends, Jason, cracked a joke to lighten the mood, but no one laughed. It was just too quiet. The sense of unease began to creep in. They continued walking, pushing through the thick underbrush, the sound of their footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. But soon, they noticed something strange. There were no animals, no bugs, nothing that would suggest the forest was alive. It was as though the place had been drained of life. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an old, high-crumbling stone well in a clearing, surrounded by overgrown vines. The well was ancient, its stones weathered and chipped. A faint, foul smell emanated from it. A thick fog had begun to roll in, making it hard to see further than a few feet ahead. "Let's head back," Lily suggested, her voice shaking slightly. But as they turned around, they froze. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall, draped in tattered clothing, with a hood pulled low over its face. They couldn't make out any details, but it didn't move. It simply stood there, staring at them. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on them. Then, without warning, the figure stepped back into the woods, disappearing into the fog. Jason, eager to prove there was nothing to fear, was the first to move. "Probably just some old hermit," he said, trying to laugh it off. "Come on, let's go check it out." The others hesitated, but they followed him anyway. The fog was thick now, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of them. As they moved deeper into the forest, a low, guttural sound filled the air, like something dragging itself through the underbrush. The group stopped, their hearts racing. They had heard it too. The sound was coming from all around them, soft, wet, dragging noises, moving closer and closer. Suddenly, Lily screamed, pointing toward the trees. There in the distance, the figure was back. Only this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving toward them, walking unnaturally slowly, its head tilted at a grotesque angle. The group turned and ran, fear taking over their senses. The trees seemed to close in around them, the path twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. No matter how fast they ran, they couldn't escape the noise. The dragging was getting louder. They could hear it moving closer, right behind them. Jason was the first to trip, falling hard onto the forest floor. He turned around just in time to see something large and dark lurching toward him from the fog. A face, an impossibly pale face, emerged from the shadows, its eyes wide and unblinking, mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Jason!" the others screamed, but it was too late. He was pulled into the darkness, vanishing without a trace. The rest of the group continued to run, adrenaline flooding their veins. They could hear Jason's screams, but they knew they couldn't stop, not until they were out of the forest. They pushed forward, desperate to escape. When they finally stumbled out of the woods, they found themselves back in the small clearing where the well stood. But something was different. The well seemed to glow faintly, a soft, sickly green light emanating from deep within. The fog had cleared, but the forest felt wrong, unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath. And then, as if on cue, they heard the dragging again. It was slow and steady, moving toward them with an unmistakable purpose. The figure emerged from the trees once more, its face now fully visible. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, the eyes hollow pits of blackness. "Run!" Lily screamed, but as they turned to flee, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The trees seemed to shift, the path twisting and bending in impossible ways. They were trapped. One by one, they were taken, pulled into the darkness, their screams muffled by the oppressive silence of the forest. By morning, the clearing was empty, save for the well, which now seemed even older, even more decayed. The fog was gone, but the air still carried the foul scent of death. The town never mentioned the students again. They simply vanished, like so many before them, lost to the forest, forgotten by all but the earth itself. And some say, if you visit Hollow Creek at night, you can still hear the dragging sound echoing through the trees, as if the forest is calling for someone new to claim.